Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors legal hotline lawyer. This video is another in our series entitled Overconfident Sellers plus Overeager Buyers equals Broker Liability. Listing brokers, I'm talking to you today. Here is the question that I can't tell you how many times I've received on the legal hotline in the last 2 months. And it's a question that prior to 2 or 3 months ago, I probably received maybe once a year or even less than that. And the question goes like this. We are in a binding purchase and sale agreement. We have mutual acceptance. In fact, closing is days away, and seller has said they won't close the transaction. They want out. Now, why am I getting this question so often right now? The reason is because the seller's marketplace is so crazy. Sellers are agreeing to sell their homes, believing that they will then go buy something else, finding out they can't go find something else. It's either not available or they can't get it. And so as closing approaches for the sale of their home, they're all of a sudden going into panic mode and saying, I'm not going to close the transaction. And so the question comes to me in the format of, I'm buyer's broker. Does buyer have any recourse? Can buyer force seller to close the transaction? And sub-question, aren't I entitled to compensation as the buyer's broker? And the answer to both questions, well, the answer to the first question is maybe. The answer to the second question is, yeah, probably. Let's take the first question. Does buyer have any recourse against this seller? I don't know. Buyer brokers, you need to advise that buyer to seek legal counsel. I can't advise that buyer as to whether or not they have recourse. You're not licensed to advise that buyer as to whether or not they have recourse. I'm assuming that the contract they have is a binding contract, and so the answer probably is yes, they have recourse. If they don't have a claim for specific performance, meaning that the court would actually force the seller to sell the property to them on the price and terms of the agreement, then they would at least probably have a claim for damages. But in reality, if that buyer hooks up with an aggressive enough lawyer, or a lawyer who can write a persuasive demand letter to the seller, then it may be that buyer and buyer's lawyer can get that seller across the finish line to close that transaction, even if buyer wouldn't necessarily prevail in a courtroom under a specific performance theory. Because seller will likely owe buyer damages, and seller will, under the purchase and sale agreement, owe buyer attorney fees and costs. All right, buyer brokers, you get your buyers to legal counsel, and you put in writing the advice that they seek legal counsel. Second question, isn't the buyer broker entitled to compensation? Yes. Seller and listing broker through the MLS made an offer of compensation to buyer's broker's firm. Hey firm, if you produce a ready, willing, and able buyer on a price and terms acceptable to seller, we'll pay you compensation. There's no arguing that buyer broker's firm did that. In this, sometimes when brokers are trying to seek compensation, there's a question of whether or not buyer's offer matched the seller's offering price and terms. In this case, there's no question because seller actually agreed to buyer's offer. The parties were approaching the closing table when seller said, I'm out. So seller has already accepted buyer's offer, meaning that buyer's broker's firm has fully performed under the terms of the offer of compensation. So yes, buyer broker's firm is entitled to compensation. In fact, so is the listing firm in that scenario entitled to compensation. And how the two firms work out that obligation for compensation, again, a different video, different topic of discussion altogether. But the fact is, seller is obligated to pay whatever commission was offered in the listing agreement at that point. Again, a strongly worded letter from the firm's legal counsel, either listing broker and buyer broker working together, or if listing firm doesn't want to roll, then buyer's broker's firm can still write that letter. Seller, if you don't close this transaction, you're still going to owe X% compensation on this transaction. You couple that letter with the letter from the buyer's lawyer, seller may be persuaded to close the transaction after all. You get your buyer to legal counsel, and firm, you seek the advice of your own lawyer and let your legal counsel help you move the ball forward from there. As a side question, another question that I've been getting a lot from listing brokers is, can seller include a contingency in their offer to avoid this scenario? In other words, seller accepts buyer's offer by making, let me back up. Seller doesn't accept buyer's offer, seller makes a counteroffer, and the counteroffer includes a contingency, and the contingency says, seller's not obligated to close this transaction if seller can't find something else to buy prior to closing. Most MLSs prohibit seller contingencies, at least seller contingencies like this. Sellers typically have contingencies for a short sale situation, which of course we're not seeing many of those today. This type of contingency is prohibited by most MLSs. Why? Because it blows up the whole MLS system. The whole MLS system is based on listing brokers making an offer of compensation to the buyer's broker if the buyer's broker brings a ready, willing, and able buyer. And if the seller has a contingency that says, I may or may not close this transaction, then how does that offer of compensation make any sense? Buyer's broker does all the work, brings the buyer, buyer does the inspection, buyer does the appraisal, and then seller changes their mind and buyer broker's not compensated and buyer loses out on all of that investment. That doesn't work. So most MLSs will prohibit sellers from including seller contingencies in their transaction if the seller is going to market the property through that MLS. That's a question that you should take up with your MLS, but you will notice there are no standardized forms for that seller contingency. If you have a question on this topic or any other, please send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.